Hey guys, welcome back to another video. I'm finally adding or making another episode on our button simulator game. This one's just gonna be a tutorial on how to be able to add more stats so you can continue on with your game rather than only having rebirths. So let's start. So what we're gonna do is, just to make it easier, what we can do is use multiple scripts for different types of buttons. So like multiplier buttons, rebirth buttons, ultra rebirth buttons and stuff like that. You could just put this all in one script, but you'd have to change it up a little bit. So what I'm going to do is in service script service, I'm going to hit the plus and I'm going to insert a folder. Then with this folder, I'm going to press F2, or you can right click it and press rename, and I'm going to rename it to, let's say, button scripts. And I'm going to put my button manager script in there. And then what I'm going to do is rename this button manager to multiplier or multiplier buttons. So this is going to be handling all the scripts that are going to be changing the player's multiplier value. So now what I'm going to do is go into our leader stat script, and we're going to add a new stat. So similar to what we did up here, we're just going to do local rebirths, or whatever you want to name your stat, equals instance.new number value player. So we're making a new variable which is going to be set to a new instance. So we're just creating a new number value and we're going to put it inside of the player, just like we did with our multiplier. Now we're going to do rebirths.name equals rebirths, or if I can capitalize it. So this is the same thing as going into the player, hitting the plus, inserting a number value, and then renaming it to rebirths. And then what we're going to do is set the default value. So rebirths.value equals 1. So this is also like going to our rebirth value we made over here and setting it to 1, except we're going to do this in a script and apply it to every player who joins the game. So now that we have a rebirth stat, we can modify it to our liking. So the first thing I'm going to do is in our multiplier buttons, we're going to make it so the amount of button or the amount of multiplier that is meant to be added when we step on one of these buttons is multiplied by the amount of rebirths the player has. So to explain this further, let's say they step on button 1. Button 1 is going to give them 5 multiplier if they purchase it. But let's say they have 2 rebirths, then instead it's going to give them 10 multiplier. So we're going to go to our multiplier buttons, and over here on this line where we're inside of our create button function, where we're making the player's multiplier value increase by the player's multi to add value, we're going to do times player.rebirths.value. And actually, let's go back to our leader stat script, and I'm just going to remove this capital as people aren't going to be seeing this. Since we're putting it in the player and not in our stats folder, it's not going to appear on the player list, meaning no one's going to see whether or not it's capitalized. So for me, it's easier to do that. You can keep it capitalized however you'd like. So back to our multiplier button script, we're just going to be adding however much the player's multipliers to increase by times the player's rebirth value. So player.rebirths.value, oh, if I can type that properly. So if you want, you can make it so instead of it doing like 2 times per rebirth, it can do 0.05 by just doing slash 0 or slash 1.5, or you could do 0.5 actually, times 0.5 or something like that. But then I would suggest putting this in brackets, as in regular math you're going to get the result. So if we don't put the brackets, it's going to be the multiplier to add times the amount of rebirth. So let's say 5 times 2 and then divided by 0.5, instead of 2 divided by 0.5 and then 5 times that end result. If that makes any sense, I'm not sure, but I'm not going to add that. I'm just going to keep this as times player.rebirths.value. So now we can move on to adding different buttons. So there's two things we can do, and we're gonna do the first method. In our buttons folder, we're gonna hit the plus and insert a new folder. We're gonna rename this folder to multiplier buttons, and then we're just gonna take all of our buttons that we created previously for multiplier and put that in our multiplier buttons folder. Then we can go to our multiplier buttons script, and in our buttons variable at the top we can change game.workspace.buttons to game.workspace.multiplier buttons, as now all of our buttons are inside of another folder, which is inside of that previous folder we called in this variable. So now what we can do is we can duplicate this multiplier buttons folder by either right clicking it and pressing the duplicate button or pressing Ctrl D. Now I'm just going to drag this slightly to the side, or actually I'm going to put this on the other side over here, and I'm going to rename this rebirth buttons. So now I'm going to remove button 2 and 3, and we're just going to keep our button 1 so we can modify this one and then copy and paste it later on to add more. So the first thing I'm going to do is go into the button part that's inside of our button 1 folder, and I'm going to go to multi.billboard, and I'm going to change this to rebirth.billboard, and then I'm just going to change the text to a darker red. I'm going to change multi to rebirth. I'm going to change the text color to a slightly darker red, just so it stands out a little bit from the color of a multiplier. That's a lighter red, this is a darker red. And then in our config, multi to add, since this is going to be the first rebirth button, I'm just going to make the multi to add 1, and we can change this to REB for rebirth to add. And then the price is how much multiplier you want the player to have. Seeming as our top button for multipliers gives us 25, I'm going to make this 150 multiplier, so you'll have to grind for a little bit to get this. So price will be 150 multiplier. So now we've set up our configuration for our new button in rebirth buttons. Now we can go to our multiplier button script in button scripts, and actually if you want you can also change the color of the top part of the button, so you can change this to a darker red. So this is still going to turn green once the player has enough, but this way we can tell that it's a different button rather than these lighter colored buttons indicating multiplier. So now we can go back to service script service, go to button scripts, and duplicate our multiplier button script, and we're going to change this to rebirth buttons. Now we can open up our script, and we can go and change game.workspace.buttons.multiplier buttons to .rebirth buttons. I'm going to be saying buttons a lot in this video since we are making a button simulator game. So now we're going to change our create function or create functions like if statements. So instead of player.leaderSets.cache.value, we want to be checking if the player's multiplier is greater than the required amount. So we're just going to do player.multiplier.value. So if the player's multiplier value is greater than the price, then if the debounce is false, we're going to if it's a rebirth, what I'm going to do is reset the multiplier to 0 instead of setting it to or subtracting from it. So we can keep this, except I'm going to change this from player.leaderstats.cache.value minus equals and then the price, and I'm just going to make it say equals 0, and then I'm going to do player.multiplier.value equals 0. So the player is going to get completely reset when they rebirth. Obviously you can change this, you can make it so they only lose some multiplier or whatever, but actually since the traditional button simulator game doesn't always reset you, I'm actually just going to keep this as player.rebirth or player.multiplier.value minus equals button.config.price.value, and then instead of player.multiplier.value plus equals button config multi-add and all that stuff, we can remove this times player.rebirth.value unless you're going to be adding another stat. and we can change player.multiplier to player.rebirths. This probably doesn't make any sense from how I'm explaining it, but it's just a lot of repetitive saying the same thing over and over again. So now, since we don't have 3 buttons and we only have 1, I'm going to remove button 1 and button 2 variables from the top, and then we can remove those 2 down here inside of our effect functions. So I'm just going to select all of these and remove it. And we can do the same thing with our touch functions down here. So we're only gonna have 1 button for now, and we can change the text over here. So instead of cash needed, we're gonna do multiplier needed, and then we're going to change this to plus, and then continuation, and then the number of multi to add, or in this case it's rebirth to add, continuation, and then rebirths. And that should change the text for when the player joins. And instead of multi to add up here, we can change this to rebirth to add as well, since we changed the, or actually it's reb to add, since we abbreviated it so it isn't as long, just like that. And now what we want to do is we can create the overhead GUI for the player. So in our overhead, we can put this in a part so we can see it. So we can just insert a part, drag our overhead into the part, and then take out the cash amount and multi amount and put it into the part, and now we can see both of these. So I'm just going to duplicate multi amount and change this to rebirth or reb amount. I'm going to make the studs offset instead of 2.5 3.5, and I'm going to copy the maroon color of the button and change the text color to that maroon color. I'm going to do the same thing for this billboard GUI so it's all consistent. It's a little bit dark in the shadow, but it's fine. And now we can put all of these billboard GUIs into overhead, and we can put overhead into replicated storage, and then we can delete this part. So now that we should have everything set up, let's just check our leader stats script that we might have to change the color of the buttons, but let's just go ahead and give this a try. You might want to change that text label. Let's just let this load up and make sure we have output open. Oh, we already have an error. Got some things to change. So in our button effects script, which got a box on my screen. So this first script is our rebirth button script in our button script folder. This error is telling us that multi billboard GUI. Oh yeah, we changed it to rebirth billboard GUI. Forgot to change that. So instead of multi BL, we're going to change this to rebirth.bl or whatever you named it here. And then our config is not a valid member of the folder rebirth buttons. So let's go to button scripts, and now we can change this up a little bit. So what we're gonna do is, instead of workspace.buttons, we're gonna do workspace.buttons, and then we can do wait for child, and then multiplier buttons, and then we can do the same thing down here. So workspace.buttons, wait for child, multiplier buttons, and we could do this, which would be copying and pasting all of this, or I'm just going to do this loop one more time, and this time it's going to be looping through rebirth buttons, and it's going to be checking if player dot rebirths dot value is greater than the price, and then it's going to change the color to green if it is, and if it isn't, we're going to change it to that maroon color, which should be that. And then we can copy and paste this for loop and put it inside of our change function. Actually, let's make a new change function, which will be player.rebirths.changed connect function. So when our player's rebirths amount changes, Actually, let's do multiplier since we want to see when the amount or the requirement changes. So when the player's multiplier changes, let's say from 1 to 2 because they gain 1, then it's just going to loop through all of the buttons and rebirth buttons and change the color of the button accordingly. This isn't the most effective way of doing this, but we're going to clean up our button effects script later on. For now, we're just going to have that as a placeholder just so we can get everything working for now. Oh yeah, we have a few names to change since we did change the names of stuff inside of our button folder. So instead of molt, it is rebirth, and that should be all of the text that we have to change for this script. So I'm gonna hit play once again, see what else errors pop up, just to see which names we have to change, if any left. So it seems that there's none left, so that says +1 rebirth, 150. Oh, now I want to remove that $sign, but 150 multiplier needed. So I'm just gonna go and hit this current client to switch to the server, so I can switch my players' cash amount. Just gonna change this to 500. Actually, let's just change to 5,000. That's a little more than 5,000, but now we should get to 150 multiplier. So if we just hit this button a few times, just get to 150. Check our output. Just gonna step on all these buttons. Now if we head over to our rebirth button and we hit it, we have 76x multiplier, so that means we did lose some multiplier. So let's hit this button a few more times, and let's go back and hit this, and yep, it is taking a multiplier. And as you can see, when we hit the 25 times button, it is giving us more than 25 times. We should have 226 if this does give us 25 times multiplier, but it's instead giving us 3 times that amount since we've got 3 rebirths. If we check our rebirth value inside of our player, and then we can continuously rebirth, and we can keep making more multiplier each time. But as you can see that in the player, if we go to the player's head, there's only cash amount and multi amount. We don't have our rebirth display like we should. If I were to copy this, see if I could just put this, well, this is changing, or this is applying on the client, so as you can see, we can keep getting more. So we would want to add our rebirths overhead to our head. So let's add this to our leader stats script, local, and we could just go to our overhead. We named it rebirth amount, so local reb clone equals, and then reb amount, or we should make a variable for that. Local reb amount equals overhead dot, or yeah, let's just do dot reb amount, which is the name of our billboard GUI, and then local reb clone equals reb amount clone, and then down here we do reb clone dot parent equals char dot head or character dot head. Now if we hit play, that should solve that. Oh, it doesn't seem to be loading. We have to add that in so it displays the player's rebirth amount. So let's head back to our leader stats script one more time, and as you can see, we have to change this. So what we're gonna do, reb clone dot, and then we kept it as molt, so reb clone dot molt dot text equals player dot rebirths dot value dot dot, and then I'm just gonna make it say rebirths. So this dot dot's a continuation. This is how we can add on 2 values into a string or something of that sort. We're just changing the text of our rebirth clone that we made over here, and now we can update it every time the value changes. So under all of our change events, we can do player.rebirths.change connect function. So this is getting when the rebirth value is changed, or if it's increased from like 1 to 2 or something like that. And then we're just gonna update the text again. So reb clone.molt.text equals player.rebirths or rebirths.value continuation space rebirths. Same thing we typed up here. So we're going to be changing the text to the player's rebirth amount. So let's say 1 and then rebirth. So we know we have 1 rebirth. Now inside of our rebirth buttons, one thing I do want to change is the $sign for the requirement. As I'm just gonna, I guess we'll put an X since it is multiplier. And we do want our rebirth buttons color to change if the player does have enough. So instead of, we go to our button effects local script instead of starter player and starter player scripts, and we change rebirths to multiplier. And then up here we change rebirths again to multiplier. I did not mean to make that say rebirths. Now make sure you always save or publish your game while you're working on it, just in case anything crashes or anything of that sort. So everything saves and you don't lose any data. So now it says 1 rebirths, and if I change my cache value, let's just change this up to, just gonna change it to like 5,000. Can get some multiplier. We should need 150. Make sure our output is open so we're aware of any errors. As you can see, our button is now green, and if we step on it, it turns red, and now we have 2 rebirths, and our multiplier gain has increased, but our multiplier has decreased. So let's go ahead and get some more rebirths. And now we're able to add more stats to our game. You can add as many as you want, just following the same method. A majority of it will be copy and paste, as it is the same thing, just slight tweaks since we're doing different stat values. So as you can see, let's get to 10 rebirths at least. Just like that. Now we're getting 100 from this one, 250 from this one. And yeah, that's how to add more stats onto your button simulator game. Hopefully you enjoyed this video. Sorry for the kind of like maybe confusing explanations or explaining. Hope you enjoyed, and see ya.